Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would review this little video that I thought would be very particularly interesting. One of the commentators, I believe, on my channel, at least here and there, I believe that either he or she, whoever it may be, but shout out overall to that person. I believe that they actually sent me a link to this video from Mr. DontaesBoxingNation. Of course, for those of you that are newer to my channel, I like to review a multitude of other channels. This is pretty much mainly a reaction channel where I like to break down things. Not just a reaction channel, but I also, of course, like to give my perspectives and my fight breakdowns or my sport breakdowns or, my fight reviews or my game reviews, depending overall on what I tend to review. But when it comes down to it, I thought that this particular video was very interesting. Of course, Mr. Terence Crawford, after his complete domination over Mr. Errol Spence Jr., the world is in a little bit of a shock. And I think that most people, including myself, probably, at least at the moment, would put Mr. Terence Crawford at the current #1 pound-per-pound spot. Terence Crawford, I believe, said the other day that he is turning 36 years old very soon. I believe that he'll be turning 36 years old in September of this year, and he said that in his personal opinion, he does not see himself boxing much longer. Now, how true that is, we'll see what ends up happening with that, but I do have to guess more than likely that Terence Crawford is going to try and go after the record and try to become undisputed at 154 pounds, especially by having the opportunity of shutting up and shutting the trap of Mr. Jermell Charlo, a person that he more than likely got under his skin. And to be quite honest with you, I don't really have a personal problem with Jermell Charlo, nor either of the Charlo brothers. I don't really have a personal problem with any of the people that I talk about, because it's my job, at least the way that I see it, to talk about things as logically and honestly and objectively as possible. And when you have a personal problem with something, then that pretty much is going to cloud your judgment. But when it comes down to it, I will say this. I certainly understand Mr. Terence Crawford's perspective. The Charlo brothers have a certain way of really trying to get under your skin. And Jermell Charlo has really talked himself up for a decent amount. But I think that Jermell Charlo realizes more than likely that his career is starting to come to a close. And certain people may disagree with that, but I mean, what other reason would you really take the Canelo Alvarez fight for? Certain people overall would say, well, he's chasing greatness. I think that in my personal view is the same thing that Mikey Garcia was doing. I'm not going to say that Jermell Charlo is avoiding anyone at his particular weight division, because I think he's pretty much conquered everyone that he's needed to there. Other than that, maybe of Tim Tszyu. And not saying that Tim Tszyu would not be a challenge. I just think that Jermell Charlo more than likely would win that fight in his best form. But I think that Jermell Charlo at this point, I just don't think that he sees much of anything to lose anymore. You have Terence Crawford or Errol Spence Jr. at the 147-pound weight class. Either of them at their best, the winner of that fight. I don't think that Jermell Charlo was going to beat either of them anyway. So Jermell Charlo might as well get a very good payday for fighting Canelo Alvarez. If he wins, he can claim he's one of the top 5 pound-for-pound fighters in the world. There would even be some people debating him as the #1 pound-for-pound fighter. And then that would even set up an even greater fight between that of Terence Crawford and Jermell Charlo. Or the more likely option, in my view, which I'm going to guess, Canelo Alvarez probably whoops Jermell Charlo's ass, whether he stops him or not, or he is, very hard on Mr. Jermell Charlo in that fight. And then Jermell Charlo goes back down to 154, has a super fight with Mr. Terence Crawford, for the undisputed titles, and then that's pretty much it from there. But we'll see overall what ends up happening. Anyways, in this video, Terence Crawford, he's also going to talk about his potentiality of facing Canelo Alvarez, which I thought was very interesting. Now, Terence Crawford, for those of you, just to kind of spoil it in an interview, Terence Crawford already stated that he doesn't really have a great interest in facing Canelo Alvarez, and I can't really blame him. Canelo Alvarez is a guy that he's decently bigger than that of Mr. Terence Crawford. Canelo Alvarez is a guy that, he rehydrates around that 185-pound range. Would not even surprise me if he rehydrates a little bit more. Terence Crawford, at the current moment in time, I believe, he probably rehydrates at around that 160-pound range. So Terence Crawford is a natural welterweight. Now, do I believe that Canelo Alvarez is a natural super middleweight or light heavyweight? No. he's pretty much a natural middleweight. But I think that Canelo Alvarez, I think even Terence Bud Crawford understands that Canelo Alvarez would be a little bit too big and a little bit too skilled for his size for Terence Bud Crawford to really go up in weight. I think that Terence Bud Crawford has aspirations to go undefeated in his career. And I do have to give him a little bit of credit because even though, of course, many people would say, well, he's trying to chase greatness, in my view, even though Canelo has lost a step or two in his career in terms of the great fighter that he once was, it still would be a very potential bad beating for Terence Bud Crawford. Not because Terence Bud Crawford cannot compete in terms of Canelo with the skills necessarily, because both of them are exceptionally skilled, but the size advantage, in my view, would just be too grand. But anyways, we're going to compare really both of them because in my view, both of these guys really shared this era. I think that when you talk about the latter part of the 2010s and the early to mid part of the 2020s, I think that it's mainly going to be remembered as the Terence Bud Crawford and Canelo Alvarez era. In my view, they pretty much shared the era. Canelo Alvarez, in my view, was the #1 pound-for-pound fighter for a few years. Many people, of course, debated Terence Bud Crawford as the #1 pound-for-pound fighter for many years. But in my view, he never really had that cherry on top. He never had that crown, that official crown, until he defeated Mr. Errol Spence Jr. and became the undisputed champion in his second grand weight class. Anyways, Mr. DontaesBoxingNation is going to talk about it. We're also going to see what Mr. Terence Bud Crawford had to say. Let's get straight into it.
DontaesBoxingNation, what's going on, guys? So Terence Crawford, he made it very clear that he wants Jermell Charlo next. Even though Jermell Charlo has a tough assignment ahead of him against Canelo Alvarez, Jermell already said after the Canelo Alvarez fight,
what Jermell Charlo has against Canelo Alvarez, if Canelo Alvarez once again shows up in decent condition, he basically is on a suicide mission because there's no way if Canelo Alvarez shows up, even the way that he was against John Ryder, I don't see a way that Jermell Charlo can beat Canelo Alvarez. I just don't. Jermell Charlo, of course, has a puncher's chance, but Canelo Alvarez, even at this age, and he's been through some wars, you know, his past couple of fights, he hasn't necessarily looked quite himself. His speed has diminished quite a bit, in my view. But in my view, Canelo Alvarez, the defense is still somewhat there, although he is more hittable than what he once was because the speed has decreased a little bit. And the fundamentals are still there. He's still a very good boxer, but I don't think that he's the A-plus boxer that he once was. A few years ago, against Caleb Plant, I thought that Canelo Alvarez looked like the best fighter in the world. He looked like an S-tier level fighter. Right now, Canelo Alvarez looks almost like an A- level fighter to me, just in my personal view, which means that the end of Canelo Alvarez could very much be here within the next couple of years. I think that he'll beat Jermell Charlo, but if he ends up fighting certain fighters like David Benavidez or even Andrade and Jermall Charlo, I would probably favor him in most of those fights, with the exception maybe of David Benavidez. But I wouldn't be surprised if Canelo lost those fights either. You can tell that he's just lost a little bit of his ability, especially in terms of his athleticism, just in terms of his speed. But when it comes down to it, you know, it is going to be very particularly interesting. But if Canelo Alvarez, once again, if he shows up in very good condition, I predict him more than likely to beat Jermell Charlo, probably about 11 rounds to 1, 9 rounds to 3. But you never know.
he's going back to his weight classes.
And I'll say this, neither Charlo brother is to be underestimated in any circumstance, because both of them, they do have great athleticism overall when it comes down to it. And on top of that, they probably age better than Canelo Alvarez because they have not been in the level of great fights that Canelo Alvarez has been in. On top of that, they do have great power, great athleticism, and they are, somewhat decently, relatively skilled. I don't think that they've ever been exceptional boxers, but they are very good. So Canelo Alvarez is to not underestimate Jermell Charlo if his career is to continue the next few years.
Natural weight class, 154. Now, once again, Terence Crawford, he wants to fight against Jermell Charlo under those circumstances that he beats Canelo Alvarez, obviously. But Terence Crawford was also asked about a possible fight against Canelo Alvarez. We heard Errol Spence say before the Terence Crawford fight that he wants to fight against Canelo after the Terence Crawford fight. And now that Terence Crawford beat Errol Spence, a lot of people are talking about a possible fight with Terence Crawford and Canelo Alvarez. So Terence Crawford, he was asked recently if a Canelo...
Well, who's really talking about Terence Bud Crawford versus Canelo Alvarez? No one that I know is really talking about Terence Bud Crawford versus Canelo Alvarez, because I think most people who know about boxing, I think they realize that that's a little bit too tall of a task for Mr. Terence Bud Crawford. Now, moving up the weight classes, of course, if you're an all-time great fighter, with, which both Canelo Alvarez and Terence Bud Crawford, they've now proved to be. But Canelo Alvarez, when you're talking about a possible 20-plus pound weight advantage when it comes down to it, if both fighters are very similarly skilled when it comes down to it, and although DontaesBoxingNation will have you believe that Canelo Alvarez is this average Mexican fighter and blah, 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 not even DontaesBoxingNation truly believes that when it comes down to it. If both of those guys got in the ring, even Canelo Alvarez at the current moment in time, there would be a possibility that Terence Bud Crawford would get hurt and stopped very, very badly. So like I said, in my view, this is not a fight that should happen.
Alvarez fight would interest him, and this is what he said.
No, not at all. Like I said before, I've got that question many times before, and I stated then, and I'm going to state it now. Canelo is 2 weight class, 3 weight classes, 4 weight classes above me, because you don't know what weight he's fighting at when he fights.
He's 2 weight classes above you, Terence Crawford. Canelo Alvarez is now 4 weight classes above you. It is what it is. And once again, a lot of people will say, well, technically Canelo Alvarez is 3 weight classes above him because Canelo Alvarez fights at super middleweight, right? But Canelo Alvarez is not really a natural super middleweight. He fights at super middleweight because none of the middleweights really could compete with him in terms of skill v skill. But when it comes down to it, all in all, no, Canelo Alvarez is not a natural 168-pounder.
He fighting 38, so you never know what weight Canelo fighting at, but at the same time, Canelo really don't interest me because of the size factor.
Well, Terence Crawford, he really doesn't.
And I have to give Terence Bud Crawford a lot of credit. He's not talking shit on possibly fighting Canelo Alvarez. He's not saying, like Gervonta Tank Davis as of recent on Mr. Terence Bud Crawford, that I'll knock him out, I'll do all these things, blah, blah, blah. And don't get me wrong, when a fighter is cornered or when they're pushed, they're going to say certain things, even maybe certain things that they don't believe because they're highly competitive. And it's their job to believe that they can win any fight. But let me give Terence Bud Crawford a lot of credit, because there's always a lot of these guys that love to talk shit about moving up multiple weight classes and knocking out this guy like Gervonta Tank Davis. I'll knock out Josh Taylor. I'll knock out Devin Haney. I'll knock out Terence Bud Crawford. And then they do absolutely no moves whatsoever to move up the fucking weight classes. So like I said, let me give Terence Bud Crawford a lot of credit.
Have to worry about the size factor, because even if Canelo was in the same weight class as Terence Crawford, he still would have never fought him. Because if Canelo Alvarez was in the same weight class as Terence Crawford, Canelo would get stopped the same way Errol Spence did. I know when Canelo was...
No, not necessarily. Because Canelo Alvarez, believe it or not, and once again, Dante, he's a part of the pro-black cult known as the LDBC in new media. So once again, you have to take everything, what he says with a grain of rice. It just is what it is. Canelo Alvarez is an all-around more skilled fighter than Errol Spence Jr., and not a lot of people are going to agree with that, but it just is what it is if you know boxing and if you know what you're watching. Yes, Canelo Alvarez is a more skilled opponent than that of Errol Spence Jr. He has better head movement. He has better defense. He can fight in a more multitude of ways when it comes down to it. He is an all-around better and smarter fighter than that of Errol Spence. No offense against Mr. Errol Spence Jr. He is an A-grade level fighter. But in that fight against Terence Bud Crawford, Terence Bud Crawford really showed a lot of his deficiencies in his game. And certain people may say, well, Errol Spence Jr., he just didn't look the same because of this, this, and this. Well, when you're really in the ring against a fighter that is an S-tier level fighter or an A-plus level fighter like Mr. Terence Bud Crawford is, all your deficiencies and inefficiencies in your boxing game or basically within your skill set, they're going to get exposed. And it's not necessarily that it was a completely different Errol Spence Jr. The reason why it looked completely different and the reason why he was acting completely different is because Mr. Terence Bud Crawford is a completely different level of fighter. Terence Bud Crawford showed that he pretty much had the advantage in every category. Like I said, Errol Spence, the reason why I predicted him to win the fight is because I thought that his power and I thought that his pressure and his activity was going to get to Mr. Terence Bud Crawford, and that his defense was going to be slightly tighter. As soon as Terence Bud Crawford showed better defense and that his power could, compete with that of Errol Spence Jr.'s, that fight was over. Once he got that knockdown in round 2, that fight was over. It is what it is. Because Errol Spence Jr. does not have great head movement. When it comes down to it, he can be pushed back. He is not a great counterpuncher. When it comes down to it, he does not have quick feet. He does not have quick hands. It just is what it is.
Watching that.
Now, if there is one fault that I would give to Canelo Alvarez throughout his career, is that he doesn't necessarily have great feet. He doesn't have necessarily fight on the balls of his feet. He can be very flat-footed. But other than that, Canelo Alvarez is exceptional in a lot of categories. Exceptional athleticism, exceptional defense, exceptional head movement, exceptional counterpunching ability. Great boxer.
Spence fight, he was saying to himself, thank God this guy is not in my weight class. But because Canelo Alvarez is...
And isn't it interesting that Canelo Alvarez, a 4-weight division champion, someone that's unified in one weight division, beaten fighters like Danny Jacobs, Arasani Lara, Gennady Golovkin, Caleb Plant, and Callum Smith, Billy Joe Saunders, and Austin Trout, all these A-grade level fighters. When Canelo Alvarez fought them, understandably, there were certain fights that did not happen, like the Charlo brothers or Demetrius Andrade or David Benavidez. But isn't it interesting that Terence Bud Crawford, that he's fought only 2 definitive A-grade fighters in his career, in Sean Porter and Errol Spence Jr., and Aki TV and DontaesBoxingNation, they're already claiming that Terence Bud Crawford is a top 5 to top 10 fighter of all time. But Canelo Alvarez can do all these things, and apparently he's not even on the level of Marco Antonio Barrera or Eric Morales. Once again, DontaesBoxingNation and Aki TV, they're not logical and objective commentators. They are a part of a pro-black cult known as the LDBC in new media. And I keep telling people this, and certain people get offended, but it's nothing to get offended about. It's just their narrative. Just as other people's narratives may be to tear down that of black fighters. When it comes down to what the LDBC's and new media's narrative is, when it comes down to it, is to make sure that fighters like Canelo Alvarez or Naoya Inoue or Tyson Fury or Alexander Usyk or Usyk, however you pronounce his name, or Vasily Lomachenko, basically any fighters that are not black American fighters, they will even go against black fighters in other countries like that in Britain. When it comes down to it, their agenda and their objective is to make sure that those fighters never grace the top 5 pound-for-pound list or are never claimed in the top 10 pound-for-pound of all time. That's what their objective is. That's what their agenda is. That's why they constantly try to tear down Canelo Alvarez, Tyson Fury, and some of these other boxers. All right? Period.
3 weight classes bigger than Terence Crawford. Under those circumstances, Canelo Alvarez, he would welcome that fight with open arms. After all, we know that Canelo Alvarez's next opponent is moving up 2 weight classes to fight him. That's Jermell Charlo.
Yes, he is. But once again, let's also be real. Canelo Alvarez is really a natural middleweight. Once again, I did not hear these same standards when Errol Spence Jr. was fighting Mikey Garcia or when Devin Haney was fighting Lomachenko. Now, to be fair, Lomachenko, that is a bit of a different situation because Lomachenko had already fought at 135 prior when it came down to it. So that's a bit of a different situation. But once again, the standards always change depending on the fighter that they like or don't like.
And if Canelo has no problem fighting against a junior...
And once again, isn't it interesting that Dante always talked all this shit about how both Charlo brothers would beat Canelo Alvarez, that even Jermell Charlo would beat Canelo if he moved up, that he would potentially even stop him. Now, all of a sudden that the fight is happening, all these excuses come out. Now, in my view, it's not actually an excuse because the size advantage is going to be very apparent in that fight. It's going to be a factor, no doubt about it. But according to Dante's standards, if you're talking all this shit about how Jermell Charlo would beat Canelo Alvarez and now he's the all-around better fighter, well, then the fight should somewhat be relatively competitive then. It should be a 7 rounds to 5 fight going either way. The way that Dante talks about Mr. Canelo Alvarez, you would think that Canelo Alvarez, that, he's just some dude overall who's just some pushover. Like he's just some Diego Corrales or something.
weight, you know he has no problem fighting against a welterweight. Now understand this, I want to make this very clear. Now, if there was no one else in Canelo Alvarez's weight class, let's say he just completely cleaned out the division and he's looking for challenges, then it would make more sense that he'd be fighting against a guy maybe 2 weight classes below him. But when you have all of the smoke in your own weight class and you're fighting against someone 2 weight classes below you, that's when it's not the best look. Now, when it comes to Terence Crawford,
I think Canelo Alvarez is going to fight Jermell Charlo, and he's also, after that, more than likely either going to fight Andrade or Jermall Charlo, which is a fight that both of them have been clamoring for a very long time anyway, but they're not going to be happy once again, because the only way that they're ever going to be happy is if Canelo Alvarez, when he finally retires, or when he finally gets defeated multiple times. That's the only way that they're going to be happy, because they don't like Canelo Alvarez. Their objective is to make sure that Canelo Alvarez, that he stays on a certain level and that he is not promoted to the #1 pound-for-pound spot or to all-time great level, which in my view is ridiculous, because Canelo Alvarez already is an all-time great fighter. You can criticize certain moves in his career all you want to, but at the end of the day, the man has fought Danny Jacobs, the man has fought Austin Trout, he's fought Arizona Lara, he fought Triple G, he fought Callum Smith, Caleb Plant, Billy Joe Saunders, Miguel Cotto, Austin Trout, Sergey Kovalev, and he won all those fights. And that's not even including Dimitri Bivol and Floyd Mayweather Jr.
but obviously he doesn't need,
Of course, the 2 fights that he lost, but still.
the Canelo Alvarez fight, because he is a 2-time undisputed champion in the sport of boxing. And now he's trying to become an undisputed champion in 3 weight classes if he gets Jermell Charlo, the Jermell Charlo fight, assuming Jermell beats Canelo. Let's see how it all plays out. That's all I got for now, guys. I'm on to the next one. All right, now check this out.
Assuming that Jermell Charlo beats Canelo. When it comes down to it, well, you just heard Dante. I'm not sure if that was a slip or what, a Freudian slip or what, but you heard him. Jermell Charlo should win that fight against Canelo Alvarez, you know, because Canelo is such a limited fighter. Once again, a big part of the reason why I like to review Dante's videos is because oftentimes he's so full of shit. And his narratives are very easily exposed if you truly know what he's up to. But anyways, talking about the comparison between Canelo Alvarez and Terence Crawford, I would have loved to see those 2 fighters really go at it. And if they would have been around the same weight, or maybe Canelo Alvarez, had he been at 154, you know, at his peak, it would have been very interesting. Terence Crawford could have gave him a lot of problems, because Terence would have had the better feet. He would have had the faster feet and, you know, clearly the better feet. I would have probably gave Canelo Alvarez a slight advantage in terms of defensive ability when it came down to it. But I also would have probably gave Terence Crawford a slight advantage fighting on the back foot, even though Canelo can fight on the back foot as well. He's very good on the back foot when he needs to be. But, you know, would have been a very great fight. Either way, you know, where do I rank both of these fighters? In my view, they're probably around the same realm. I have both Terence Crawford and Canelo Alvarez probably within my top 30 fighters of all time. You know, you could easily debate them also within the top 20 range. You really could, because there is a great debate of Canelo Alvarez being within that same realm, you know, of the Lennox Lewises and, you know, that's of, you know, whoever else you may put there, the Roberto Durans or the Chavezes. You know, you could debate that Canelo Alvarez is right there. You truly could. Those 20s to 30s range, in my view, it's very fluid. Now, I'm not quite sure if I would put either Terence Crawford or Canelo Alvarez within my top 10, at least quite as of yet. But, you know, there are certain people that might even put them there. Either way, great amount of respect to both of these fighters. I certainly grew up a lot of the times watching both of these fighters. And if you knew what you were watching, you knew that both of these fighters were special. Although it did take Terence Crawford a lot longer to prove it, because eventually he had to go over to the PBC to prove that he could beat some of their fighters. But very great on both Mr. Canelo Alvarez and Terence Crawford. I also agree with Mr. Terence Crawford. I think the size disparity would just be too much. I think it would be too much. So good on him for not talking all this shit like other certain fighters may do, like Gervonta Tank Davis, or other fighters that like to call out certain fighters of certain fights where they know that fight will never happen. So, you know, very good on him. But anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. I just thought that I would talk about that. Of course, the next big fight this year is that of Canelo Alvarez versus Jermell Charlo, which is going to be a very interesting fight. It's going to be a very interesting fight, but we'll see. But anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.